Have you ever woken up, not even put your feet on the floor, and thought about the million things in your life that you are not happy with, that you wish you could change, the things you thought your life was going to look like, and yet for some reason you feel like you just cannot seem to make those things happen? Maybe you think, screw it, what's the point? Everything is bad luck for me. Life is predetermined. I'll never get ahead. Maybe even deeper than that, below the surface, you think, I'm not worthy of good things happening. Or you got something good in your life and you are terrified of losing it. And so you get frozen and don't know how to do things to keep it. While trauma is a part of the human experience, it seems that up to 90% of us experience at least one traumatic event, divorce, death, things like that. I would argue that if you're here on this channel, you've probably had a lot more than one event in your life. There's a good chance you have a lot of PTSD from single event traumas, and a really good chance you grew up and or spent childhood and adulthood in relational trauma. I just have noticed that some people seem to be able to move through life, even with a lot of difficulty, with more resilience, with more belief in themselves, and with more agency in others. And it got me wondering, how could I share when I think about my own life, what my strengths are, and hear what your strengths are, and find a way to come to some understanding about the role of trauma, attachment, resilience, and something called the locus of control we're going to talk about today. So at the end of this video, my goal is for you to understand a bit more about yourself, about the impact of relational trauma and maltreatment in childhood, a little bit more about your attachment patterns and how those might show up in your life, and about specific steps on how to increase the more internalized part of yourself that feels like they know how to access, even in spite of all your pain, more control over your life. So this is the video for you to watch if you want to learn how to understand yourself and what you can do. I'm a licensed psychologist, and my goal this year is to create more and more videos that dive even deeper between attachment and complex trauma and things that you do have some control over in your life and some ways to work on healing. This video is going to include some research. I'll link all of it down below, alongside just some more information that I hope you'll find helpful. Let's start by defining some terms, and some of these terms we're going to come back to in future videos. The first term is resilience. What does that mean? Resilience is really about our ability to bounce back in the world after something has happened to us. That's just the bottom line of it. I'm going to read you a definition here. It says, resilience is generally defined as the ability of an individual to bend but not break, to bounce back, and to adapt well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, or even significant sources of stress. Now that is something to keep in mind about how that applies to every individual, and the way it's going to work is going to be different. So your resiliency is based on a number of factors, not just about what happened to you, but about your genetic makeup, your generational trauma, your history, and even things like the culture and society you live in. We're going to come back to that. The next important term is the term of locus of control. So when I started researching resilience, I wanted to know, in a way that I could share here, what factors affect that. And it turns out that one of the factors is locus of control. And while it is on a spectrum, People tend to be, more wired and more predisposed and or adopt a more internalized or more externalized locus of control. Location, locus. Where do you find the answer to things? If you have a more internal locus of control, you tend to believe that you have some control over your life, that you can do some things to heal, to grow, to learn, that there's some part of your life you have agency over. The flip side of that, at the complete other end, is the external locus of control. And people, also a lot of childhood trauma survivors we're going to talk about, often have a more externalized locus of control. And what that means is that for many reasons, like I'm saying, trauma is a big one, they believe that, most things are fate, they have bad luck, most things are predetermined, so I can't really change much. Now, the truth is that both of these belief systems have their advantages. Of course, a more generalized internal locus of control tends to produce individuals who are happier and more satisfied in their lives and relationships, people who are healthier and tend to achieve their goals. In fact, this concept, locus of control, is also very common in health psychology and in workplace psychology. The idea that you are a master to some degree of your fate. Now, if you only believe that, but you don't have any of the external space, you get into trouble when you reach a point in life where you've done everything you can, or you realize that some things in life you just can't control. So we want to learn to cultivate a more internalized locus of control, but also cultivate some external locus of control, because that helps us when we say, look, for example, I did everything I could and it still didn't go my way. I'm going to surrender to that. But we don't want to be in, oh, well, why even bother? It's not worth it. It'll never happen. For example, imagine two people that go to the doctor. They have the exact same genetic makeup. And the doctor says, you know what? We determined through this series of tests that you, in your future, are more predisposed to having something like diabetes. Person A, who is more internally focused, says, okay, I get that. Don't love that, but I can work on my diet. I can work on exercise. There are some things I can do. I'm going to try. Person B says, externalizer, well, my grandfather had diabetes. My mom had diabetes. I've always been someone who struggled with their weight, or risk factors, so why bother? You can imagine that the outcomes might be very different. Now, let's say person A does everything they're supposed to and they still end up with some form of illness, diabetes. They would want to be able to say, I did everything I could. I'm not going to continue to drive myself crazy, but it happened anyway. So I'm going to surrender to that. So that's kind of the idea. The problem with all of this is that what the research shows is that attachment experiences in childhood, as they relate to maltreatment, especially ongoing cumulative or chronic wounding for children, and the earlier the wounding happens, the more likely they are to have an externalized view of the world in terms of locus of control. So why is that? It's because if you were being maltreated from the time you were a little person, you never had the experience that you had any control over anything. You were truly a victim to your circumstances. And so you're more likely, the research shows, to believe that. Now, if it happens, let's say some kind of wounding over a period of time when you're a little bit older, those kids might have a little bit more internal locus of control because they had some experiences that said, okay, things were this way and now they're that way. It's not like a global view. So what role does attachment play? It plays a big one when we're talking about trauma. And I want to read this to you. It says, our results present several implications with regard to intervention. Our data show how maltreatment, especially when linked with cumulative trauma, affects the development of self, perceived self-efficacy, and all the cognitive skills that form the basis of social skills. And I'm going to make a separate video about this, but self-efficacy is also important to resilience because it is about the belief that you can exact change. So even if you own the fact that you need to take care of your risk factors, let's say for diabetes, if you own it and say, I internally accept that, but I don't think I can, I don't believe I can, I'm not worthy of it, that would be low self-efficacy. So even though you were trying to own it, you might not be successful. So we're going to talk in the next video about how to enhance self-efficacy in yourself and therefore to expand your horizons and goals and achievements and really just healing in your life. It says, as stated above, abuse that starts at an early age prevents the development of a sense of autonomy and competence based on the feeling of being in control of events. And so the studies show that it was observed that the feeling of having control over one's life is closely related to the experience of early childhood. So here we are back at attachment. That's why we talk so much about childhood trauma and what happens to us. It's not about just get over it. Why can't you move on? It is about understanding that these elements most likely affected you. And to really work on healing, it has to be at least acknowledged to yourself, even if those in your life who created this problem won't do that for you. So in other words, it says kids who suffered maltreatment really have little confidence in their ability, especially if they're younger and it's ongoing. They lack the ability to even own their circumstances, and especially things that are highly emotional, really frustrating, really difficult, or unpleasant. And we know that sometimes we have to endure really unpleasant things in the pursuit of our goals. But I thought it was really important to understand that your world lens, on the one hand, I always think, if I'm in a crisis, I almost want to look around the room and find one of the more traumatized people, because my guess is, especially if they had immature, eggshell, narcissistic, traumatized, whatever parents, and they grew up in chaos, many of them, and many of us, I will argue, get really calm in chaos. It is how we survived our childhood. So on the one hand, I think some of the most resilient people I know are, frankly, the more traumatized people who've had more difficult circumstances. But the problem is also the fact that, yes, they've survived, but deep down inside, they might just be surviving in life. They might not know how to take more control to thrive. And so that is what this video is about. It's like, how can you control more things in your life to feel a sense of success? So we've looked at what resilience looks like, and just to kind of go through some questions to give you an example of resilience, let's kind of look at this. This is based on a 10-item, the Connor-Davidson resilience scale. There are a lot of resilience scales. Just to give you an idea of the essence of resilience, there are 10 questions. I'm just going to read them out loud to you, and then I want you to think about kind of how you think you respond to these things. Number 1, I am able to adapt when changes occur. Number 2, I can deal with whatever comes my way. Number 3, I try to see the humorous side of things when I am faced with problems. Number 4, having to cope with stress makes me stronger. Number 5, I tend to bounce back after illness, injury, or hardships. Number 6, I believe I can achieve my goals even if there are obstacles. Number 7, under pressure, I stay focused and think clearly. Number 8, I am not easily discouraged by failure. Number 9, I think of myself as a strong person when dealing with life's challenges and difficulties. And number 10, I'm able to handle unpleasant or painful feelings like sadness, anger, and fear. Now, I want to say that it may not be that every single one of those every time, but that overarchingly you eventually recover. You eventually deal with things. I think it's better to think about that scale as like how you respond overall to something, not like every single thing you're going to be like, oh, I can handle everything. Because oftentimes we feel like, for me, one of the greatest sources of how I get more tapped into my locus of control in an internalized way is when I feel the most powerless and trapped and I don't know what to do. And one of my best skills is problem solving. It just is. My therapist is like, that's one of the best things you do. I sometimes over try to fix things, like with my kids. I can't say that's always a good strategy, because they actually said to me, Mom, you can't fix everything. And so that can be an over coping. That is not what this video is about. But the point is that more often than not, you recover, you keep moving. Two things I want to say is if you have chronic mental or physical health issues, that's important to honor within this whole video, right? There's only so much you can do. If you are so depressed, you cannot get off the sofa, it's really hard to think about all the things you can do in this video. So I want to say that. But I'm going to come back to that in the list of things you can do later. But I want to honor that those things matter. If you have physical limitations, disabilities, health issues, all of it, this is about finding the space where you can increase that locus of control. And the second thing is this, that everything I'm talking about in this video and the next few videos, we have to always take into account not only genetics and each person's story and their environment, but the world in which they grow up in. So race, economic status, right? Socioeconomic status, culture, identity, all of these things can have an impact. So if you have been a repressed human being in this world, and there are a lot of us for many different reasons, it's not so simple as, well, you don't really have the same opportunities as somebody else maybe, right? So you don't want to just say like, oh, we'll just fix that. But the world, the environment, the culture, your city, where you live makes it harder. So we always want to also hold those, right? There are always other factors. So this is not about just like disregarding those things, okay? Now let's talk about locus of control. Once again, we're going back to the internalizer and the externalizer. The internalizer says, I can change some things. I have some power and control. The externalizer is like at the end of the spectrum. I don't have it at all. Why bother, right? And don't forget, like I said, why bother is a big part of traumatized human beings. Now, before I go into the more details of this and I share what I hope will be some helpful tips, I also want to say that in an interesting twist of events, one of the most important parts of coming to terms with what happened to you, especially if you have childhood trauma or any trauma, adult trauma as well, because I feel like I've had, with my mom, for example, in my adult life, adult PTSD, adult CPTSD, in as much, if not more than childhood, literally, from the time I was 23 until now, still ongoing. Some things are still difficult. So the point is, though, that one of the important things, especially in childhood, is that you come to a place where you can say, nothing that happened to me in childhood was my fault. I was a child. I had no power. That is not the same thing as you saying, so why bother? But that's where surrendering to externalized locus of control is really important. So it might be holding you down from engaging and being more like, trying to control things in your life. But in that space, it's really important to honor that there is and was nothing you could do but survive that childhood, period, full stop. A child's only job is to survive. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about kind of what you can do as it relates to locus of control. And one more really important piece of this is that you become very aware of the things that sabotage your desire to have more control in your life, to make things happen. It's often the mindset of self-victimizing, which once again aligns with having a very externalized locus of control. So what would that sound like, right? So if you're in that part, if you're like, I'm not really sure, do I really do that? This is kind of what it would look like. Number one, you would often believe that good things that happen, whatever happens that goes your way is really like not a result of you, but just a chance of luck, something out of your control, your horoscope, like whatever it is, you don't feel like it really is about you. Number two, when you have a setback, you tend to blame others. You tend to not really own your part in things. And I always think about Lisa Rinna from The Housewives. If you've ever watched, Beverly Hills Housewives, there was this thing she'd always say, own it, own it, own it. And this is really about owning it. This whole video is about owning it. like I said, with the understanding and love of your childhood trauma, self-compassion, your attachment patterns and things like that, owning it more. Number 3, when you are upset, you feel like your emotions are out of control. You put them on others, you lose it, and you don't work on apologizing, repairing, learning to emotionally regulate more. It's like everything is externalized onto someone else. You don't really have any role in that. It's like it just happens to you, like those things aren't happening through you, if that makes sense. When you have an argument or a fight with your partner or your friends, you always tell yourself what they did wrong. You tell others, but you don't really own the part you may have played. And lastly, when you hit a challenge, something hard, work, family, relationships, you tend to bail, you tend to blame, you roadblock, you stonewall. You don't really do yourself a service in saying, okay, I'm going to roll my sleeves up, look at this problem and try to figure it out. What belongs to me? What doesn't belong to me, right? So you tend to externalize. It's almost like nothing is in your control. The world, people, your emotions, your story. It's like the childhood lens of that little child who it wasn't their fault can't open up and grow. It's like you're stuck in the childhood and you can't look at with compassion both sides of that. So like I said, we're going to come back to self-efficacy and the role that plays and the traits of emotional resilience. It's like, what does it look like to be emotionally resilient in the next video, and how to cultivate things like perseverance and perspective and all those kind of things. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about what you can do. If you're like, okay, I get this, I understand. Before we go into what you can do, I want you to be really aware of your attachment style in terms of how that might affect the way you might do your best here, where you might hit roadblocks, where you might tend to self-blame or really victimize yourself and fall into a more externalized pattern. So we're going to skip secure people because we think that for the most part, they could probably grow in their sense of self too in terms of these things, but they're probably a little further along. But for those of us who have trauma and who've had a lot of issues and are trying to grow and really just take more control over our lives, I think this is the thing where we can have what's called learned helplessness. And I'm not going to discuss that in this video, but it is often a component of all of these things, right? So these are more terms we're going to come back to. Attribution theory. What do you attribute things to? In other words, if someone blows at you, if you think that they had a bad day, you're more forgiving, for example, than if you believe they have it out, they're out to get you, or they have a personality disorder or something like that, right? So all these things matter. So I'm making this kind of simplified, but I want to make sure we honor those pieces. So what does the research say about our attachment styles? It says that we're talking about a more anxious attachment style. And don't forget, that's about a lot of unpredictability in the caregiver and often about overexposure to the caregiver's state of mind, right? So here we're going to see a lot of emotional dysregulation, a lot of anxiety, worrying, overthinking, overanalyzing. And you can think your way out of almost doing anything if you overthink it, right? Or you just get so flooded with anxiety, it makes you unable to move. Or you're hard on yourself and you fail and you overthink that. So just hold in mind how that part of you that wants to please, that wants to always get reassurance, that feels like you're going to be abandoned and left, might show up in you abandoning yourself in these steps. And so just keep that in mind. If you have a more avoidant style, the research shows that what these people tend to do is to turn away from what is uncomfortable. So let's say you're doing the steps I'm suggesting and you don't do well. So you just blow it off. You forget about it. You bury it. You don't let yourself feel about it because you'll think, oh, I failed that day. I didn't accomplish my goal. So that's going to sabotage you because before you know it, you've buried everything. You're not dealing with it. And then why even bother, right? So now you're kind of back to a more, well, that's just how the world works. And you're not taking ownership over how to heal your life more, your relationships, your job, your dreams, really. Your dreams are so important. And if you believe you have no control over anything, then you're so much less likely to make that happen. And then at the core, and I'm going to talk so much more about this, is that for those of us who have had childhood trauma with parents who were really unpredictable at the heart, right? Eggshell, I use that word a lot because I think it encompasses everything from parents with bipolar to trauma to even autism, certainly to borderline and narcissism potentially, where you just kind of never knew what to expect, or things were conditional, and or the parents' mood and mind really ran the show in your home, one or both. Is that you're going to be more likely, and the research shows that those of us who have childhood, trauma often have a more disorganized attachment pattern. And so we have this thing where our parents were either safe to approach or we had to avoid them. And they were approaching and avoiding us. It's like the source of safety, approach, I want to approach my parent, is also the source of fear. Got to avoid, right? That is the dilemma for disorganized attachment. And a lot of the work I've done on the courses and stuff that I talk about is about the research on children of, like, for example, borderline mothers who have borderline, who struggle with some significant form of emotional and relational instability. I really do believe that some version of that is why I can post a TikTok on eggshell parents and have 4.5 million views and hundreds of thousands of likes, right? And I think people just inherently get the concept of walking on eggshells. And there's a lot more to it than that. But the point is that the parent is often, hard to predict, emotionally unstable, wants you to help regulate their emotions by being a best friend, by being a co-parent, by being parentified in the house, raising other siblings, running the home, whatever it is. And they're often externalizing all of their needs onto you. They're looking to you to manage and regulate. And as a child, you learn to hold that big old basket of dysregulation for parents, and you're so much more likely to struggle with those things in yourself and with picking partners who you think are different but make you feel the same. This is really, really important because for those of us who have this childhood wound, this maltreatment, this cumulative trauma, we often have this deep desire to not be left, to be loved, to not be abandoned, to believe we're deeply flawed. And yet, because of the consuming nature of our parents, we also are terrified of you consuming us. And I really believe that's why I talk so much about silent trauma. Many of us live in hypervigilance, so we're scanning for threat, but we're also tending to be more isolators when we feel emotionally flooded, right? It's like it's too much for us. So what can you really do? Is it really possible to cultivate a greater sense of internal control? The answer is yes, and the research really is clear. While it might be very difficult for us for so many reasons, especially if we have some form of complex PTSD and or PTSD, we can still do it. We can still change our lives. So the following steps and suggestions are all research-based and encouraged by really everyone who says, okay, these are the things it takes to cultivate a greater space of creativity and thoughtfulness and inspiration and truly control over your life and relationships, okay? Number one is to start small. So just pick one thing. It might be a big thing in the sense that you want to have more control or work towards managing your emotions in a different way. Maybe you want to really be able to sit back and assess the relationship you're in and decide if this is really where you want to be in your life. This career, these friendships, this neighborhood, whatever it is. Pick one thing and make sure that you write it down somewhere. In your phone, in a journal, just a place where you're going to be able to remember and see it. Number two, it's really important if you can do this, and I know it is difficult. Trust me, I go in and out of doing this, but the research is clear that when you start your morning on your cell phone, that 90% of us or so wake up and grab our phones. We're on social media, we're on the news, that we are interrupting the natural state of waking up for our brain waves. We are introducing often cortisol, rushing through our body in terms of stress and anxiety by reading the news. I even notice just going on sometimes like TikTok, I'll start to compare myself and that will trigger something. But I also know that that definitely increases my anxiety. So the research is clear that the idea would be to start small. Maybe it's 5 minutes. Maybe you just spend the first 5 minutes not going on your phone and you work up to 30 minutes or even an hour. What I often do is grab my phone, but I will only use an app that has music, like meditative music. I love Insight Timer, and no, it's not sponsored. I just love their free stuff. And so I'll play a 20-minute, 30-minute, 15-minute, just kind of very soft musical meditation. I don't even do like a guided meditation at this point. I just do the music, light a candle, put the fireplace on, make my coffee, and just try to sit with my blankets on the sofa and just let my brain start to wake up and try to be mindful of what kind of thoughts are coming up. The next step is to introduce some form of exercise, especially a cardio program. And you're going to be like, oh my God, we know this, but it really is important. And one of the things I've been doing, which as I combine this step with another step, which is creating, this is number 4, a practice of quiet time. So what I will do is I'll put my earphones on, my headphones, and I'll walk down by the beach, but I will not listen to music for the first half an hour to an hour. I will just have it be quiet and try to observe the sounds. But what happens is my brain often gets flooded with ideas and creativity about all kinds of things that if I listen to music, which can also be really great for your nervous system, but it doesn't often allow as much space for true quiet thoughts and just a peacefulness to occur. So you can do those separately or together, but moving your body, if it's just outside the door, putting, your shoes on the treadmill, going to the gym, doing Pilates, whatever it is, but you do want to get your heart rate up ideally. And for those of you who aren't able to move your body, trying to find whatever the equivalent is for you, whatever you can do that helps you, A, move your body or get going in some way, and B, ideally for anyone, create a period of quiet time, a reflection time every single day. The next thing is to prioritize sleep, and everyone knows this, but it is such a profound part of mental health and well-being and physical health. We know from so many studies that many of us are sleep deprived, we have poor quality of sleep, and that we're often pushing it, right? We're buying ourselves extra time at night to be alone after the kids are down or whatever's going on, but we're paying the price for it. And so really investing in sleep hygiene, temperature, materials, sounds, timing of sleep, incredibly important. The whole goal of all of this is to get you in a space where you're actually open to being able to be more controlling over the things in your life. And you're not just reacting to everything and just trying to manage, spiraling out of control, exhaustion, fear, things like that. The next one is to cultivate a practice of internal versus external challenging of your thoughts. This is kind of the idea behind the whole, challenging cognitive distortions, to recognize that your brain is going to have all kinds of reasons and answers why you can't do something, why it won't work, you should do something, it's going to catastrophize, right? All of that black and white thinking, but that when you boil it down, what you're really challenging yourself on every day when you have this idea about something that you think, never mind, what's the point, why bother, is to say, really, is this an internal or external thing I can control? So maybe you put like a pros and a cons sheet and you write it down. Okay, well, what could I control? Alongside this is the next step, which I really love to do, is just a brainstorming. So maybe it's you can't stay in your same apartment, the rent's gone up. Maybe it's you want to change your job, is to sit down and write it out and brainstorm. What are all the things I could possibly do and control? What can I not control? But you're forcing yourself to engage in an exercise of mindfully approaching what you can control and what you can't. The last few things are to be okay with sometimes not getting it right, to have self-compassion for when you don't get it right, when you could have tried harder but you didn't, right? To have a very kind of reparenting experience where you go to yourself and say, you know what, I gave up too soon this time, I don't feel good about that. And the loving parent says, it's okay, you've got tomorrow, try again. Or, hey, you know what? This all sounds great. Is there anywhere else you could try to think about or brainstorm where you could create some change in your life in some way? Or, like I said, just really meeting yourself from a place of this just didn't go well, or I wasn't motivated and I couldn't do it this time. And to lovingly say, that's okay. There'll be another chance for you to try again. Again, it's really important to keep in mind that what will sabotage you is often your attachment system, clearly things where you self-victimize and don't realize you're doing that because part of self-sabotage is part of your childhood or your story in life. And if you have any mental or physical health issues, which most of us have, both or some, that trying to find ways to deal with those are extremely important. Don't neglect those things. And I know, especially for like autoimmune disease, fibromyalgia, a lot of those very trauma-related IBS illnesses, it can be very difficult to even get a diagnosis. And so that can take years. Certainly mental health, since, in the last several years, has become even more difficult to access. So maybe you can't afford, right now a therapist, but you can save up or look for one through your job if you have insurance. That can take longer to get on a list for, I know. Maybe take a course, listen to a podcast, read a book. Just do something that every day, ideally, or even every other day, helps carve out a focus on healing and dealing with and getting support for those issues. So like I said, in the next few videos, we're going to talk more about what if you don't believe in yourself? What role does your trauma and childhood attachment patterns play in how you can sort of do all of these things? It's incredibly important. And we don't want to just make it sound like, oh, just check this box and get some sleep and do a meditation. But it is truly about creating and cultivating a new experience in your life and in your brain where the possibilities are even allowed to emerge. So many of us are just spending our time going from one distracting activity and numbing activity to another, right? Our phones, work, parenting, relationships, the news, our shows. And I do a lot of binge watching. I love those kind of things, but it doesn't help me when I have no quiet space to really challenge how I'm approaching my life. Just like these videos, I was like, God, I just feel like I need to offer more. What else can I do? And so over the break, because I gave myself a break, I found myself watching a bunch of YouTube videos, watching creators that I really admire and thinking, how can I improve what I'm doing? What else needs to change? But last year, I just couldn't do it. I just struggled with a lot of health issues and I just wasn't motivated. And so sometimes we have those seasons where it's just not going to happen. And that is okay. It really is. The goal is just to move a little bit forward each time that you are aware and each time that you can. So thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon.